Institute for Overall Analysis of the Economy. Since 2015, he has been professor of economics and cultural history at the Casanus Hochschule in Bern-Kassel-Kues. His focus are the cultural history of economic theory and issues of political communications. The title of his talk is Surveillance, Capitalism and Freedom Ideology, Criticism of the Theoretical Basis of Missing Regulation. So please give a warm welcome to Walter.
Vielen Dank für die Einladung.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm happy to deliver a lecture within the framework of this symposium. When we're talking about digital humanism and if we want to define a European position, so if we want to define a European position, we could take a step back and ask ourselves, why is this an issue at all? There are other human rights for children, for example, that have never been put into question. That is a cultural achievement. And for a cultural historian, we have a rather new situation, not older than 15 years. What kind of situation has arisen? I'm not an expert in the infrastructure of the internet. I'm not a software expert. I'm not a software on legal regulations. I'm an expert in the cognitive basis for the reflection on society. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'll be referring to the history of this development, the history of the internet, and the history of society. Let me start with three brief comments. First, the internet was developing in the field of defense and the field of science originally. In 1990, its commercialization began, and the internet underwent a fast development until the dot-com bubble first developed and then burst. There was a crisis of the internet, and then the internet was reinvented on a commercial basis, with Google being the pioneer. And this is what I'm going to talk about, this invention and the cognitive basis for this invention. This is to do with US-American cognitive basis. My third comment refers to the Big Four. Look at the right-hand column. This is the market capitalization of the Big Four. Microsoft holding first position, and then Apple, Amazon, a year ago, in terms of market capitalization, they've reached more than $1 trillion. Now, what are the backgrounds of this development? What is the specific cognitive basis for commercialization of the internet. We're talking about the 1990s, the implosion of state socialism, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the tragic events on the Square of Heavenly Peace in Beijing, and then foreign direct investments started in China, and then the specific Chinese variant of capitalism started. No more ideological trench warfare. Capitalism has won. More than 2 billion people living in a capitalist society. Globalization as a current event and as a cognitive event, all driven by an ideology of deregulation, active and passive deregulation. Passive deregulation means that when overwhelming creativity in the economic sphere conquers new areas, the state and the regulatory authorities don't even think of regulating that. And this is exactly what happened with the internet. Some call it neoliberalism, I call it market fundamentalism. The hypothesis, which I will explain, is that of the commercialization of the internet. After the crisis of the internet in the 2000s, a specific variant of this type of thinking emerged. Now, what do I mean by market fundamentalism and neoliberalism? We're talking about the market as a category. The market like a person, an acting person with its own rules and laws, processes and sequences that are autonomous and cannot be controlled. There is a homogeneous sphere which is extremely complex, but as economists tell us, there are simple and abstract rules. It's a dichotomy, either more a market or more of the state. Now, I specialize in the history of categories of thinking. And how does this way of thinking translate into practice or reality? We have to use simple images. The most simple one is that of supply and demand. It's being interpreted in different ways. The crucial statement on this form of functioning says that capitalism is a system which is extremely efficient, and the crucial term is allocational efficiency. This is what the structure of the system looks like. The acting entities at the bottom, an algorithm has been implemented, and there is a coordinating center, which is the market, which also has an optimal algorithm, and the results are bound to be optimal as well. And the data input we can input here are the given preferences. So this says that in capitalism the preferences prevail, the consumer is sovereign, and when the consumer changes opinions, the market will adjust. Another variant, which is widespread in the United States, and also has an influence on the government via think tanks, comes from the Austrian School of National Economy von Mises and Hayek. Hayek says we cannot base ourselves on the preferences because the preferences are information quantities which are not based on observation. Hayek's picture or image of the market is completely different. It looks like this. Hayek says it's not the preferences that come first, but knowledge held by people. And this takes us to an economy of knowledge. People have basic knowledge, they have heterogeneous knowledge, they have implicit knowledge, and we have to visualize the market as a body of knowledge. Hayek says the market discovers knowledge, transforms knowledge, and into an efficient, optimal form. The market serves for the dissemination of information. Hayek's idea is based on that. Hayek says the market incorporates or embodies knowledge. Prices, according to Hayek, are a mechanism, and back in the 1930s, he said already it works like a telecommunication system.
Dieses System wird absolut radikal definiert.
This system is
Die radikale
defined
Definition ist
radically.
zum Beispiel die, dass ich hier kein
The
Konzept habe
radical
von Gesellschaft.
definition says that you have no notion of society. All there is the individual and the market. And Hayek,
Ungeheuerlich ist,
in ideological terms,
den
defines
von Bewusstsein und Vernunft,
the market in terms of
Konnotation
consciousness
Überbewusstsein und
and
Übervernunft.
reason.
Ein überbewusster Mechanismus,
He
schreibt
speaks of a
der oberhalb der Bewusstseinsinhalte der
supraconscious
einzelnen Individuen operiert,
mechanism
aber selbst nicht bewusst sein kann.
that makes individuals conscious but cannot be conscious itself. Now, if we agree that the market embodies consciousness, we arrive at a crucial question. Ultimately, this is a confrontation with the fundamental principles of enlightenment. Is the human being conscious? Is the human being reasonable? Does the human being have reason? Hayek defines the human being as a being of history, being unconscious and non-reflective. He says society is made up by constitutive ideas, and these ideas are being followed in an unreflected manner. He says when we constitute ourselves as a society, forces in society change, and we react like iron chips react to a magnet. The most brutal variant I found with Hayek is only implied occasionally, but never fully implemented. He says the market is a network, and then he abandons the level of the individual. He says we don't need to reflect on that. We reflect on human beings as a network of interneuronal connections, a network which is unconsciously coupled to the market. This is a dystopia of the market, defined theoretically by Hayek. And this is a cognitive dystopia which dates back to Hayek. All that had an enormous influence in the United States. So what Hayek is doing is the following. The supra-conscious market is contrasted with the conscious human being. And there is a single sentence I want you to reflect on. When we reflect on the market, by reflecting on the market, we are referring to knowledge of which we know limited, and we can put it in radical terms. We can no longer apply our reason in reflecting on this system of knowledge. And Hayek says, and this is very interesting, he says that non-knowledge is a virtue. He says the task of science is not to disseminate knowledge. Agnotology is the theory of ignorance. So it's not about knowledge, it's about the dissemination of non-knowledge, a prohibition of thinking about alternatives. And reflecting on the market is presumptuous. The background being a confrontation with the constitutive elements and on reason in the sense of the Enlightenment. This is a variant that stands up against enlightenment. This conception of the market has numerous implications. These implications have prevailed to a certain extent. One could try and reflect on society. There is no longer a notion of society. Margaret Thatcher said there is no such thing as society. It becomes a regulatory term, and the conceptual potential of economy defining itself and society arises. And this is the kind of society we live in. We live in an economized society. Politics has to actively constitute the market and must not interfere passively with the market. It's the media are for propaganda. I described science, and as regards the notion of in the sense of potential actions. And there are no personal rights. The hypothesis is that the commercialization of the internet after the dot-com bubble is based on this specific conception of the market. It's based on an ideology of deregulation. Eric Schmidt, Google's CEO, says that the internet is the biggest non-regulated space of the world, and what is new is the internet as an auction market. Now, what are the economists doing? The economists are taking the position of market designers. I'm afraid I don't have enough time to explain everything. I can only refer to the highlights. Google with Hal Varian as the chief economist. He's particularly interesting because Hal Varian writes textbooks, which are the most widespread textbooks also in the German-speaking area.
Das dann von Google ausgehend die Big Fours entwickelt haben.
So the Big Fours.
Der User macht eine Suchanfrage.
The user enters
Diese
a search
Suchanfrage wird in
query.
Keywords übersetzt.
The
Jedes
query is
Keyword wird
translated
ökonomisch
into
bewertet.
keywords. Each
Keyword
keyword
Price Index.
is valued economically. On the one hand, you have the companies that advertise, that enter text and images, enter keywords themselves, or this is done by Google, and the companies want to make their offers. And now there is a specific option. In this option, all ranking positions are sold at once, and it's based on the second best price reasoning. It's a system which, according to a certain economic theorem, ensures the greatest possible profit for the offering company, and the result is a ranking of ads, who is at the top and who is at the bottom. This is the fundamental idea, which is being realized also by others than the Big Fours. You need an enormous amount of data for the ad quality. What's the quality? What's the probability? And then you have learning algorithms. You need models about the users. What's the quality of the users in this economic process? Google invents new things every 1 or 2 years, and things keep moving. So an enormous volume of data extraction. I can't read it out here, but when you think through that in terms of principles, you could say that any manifestation of life that can be digitalized in any way is being recorded in complex models processed by an unknown algorithm, and that results in a profile, both Google and Facebook, of everyone, every single person that is active on the internet. At least 10,000 items per person. Google knows more about me than I do myself. My memory is deteriorating, and Google knows me better than I know myself.
Unregulierter Raum, niemand fragt es, jede Likes, alle Fotos.
It's an unregulated space. Everything is being recorded, every movement, everything you are doing wherever you are going, from outer space. Tiny objects can be identified. Google is a surveillance agency with surveillance procedures, and the relations between companies and their customers are being restructured completely. Companies don't need to care about their customers. There is complete lack of transparency as to what is being collected. There is no private property right to myself and my own data. It's an accumulation through expropriation. I have no more rights. There is no transparency as to the algorithm. We don't know which algorithm is used by Google. We don't know which algorithms are the underlying ones for Facebook. The Google algorithm is changed hundreds of times every day. Economists call it matching. A small change is made, and then the reaction of certain groups of the population is monitored. So this is how the self-learning algorithms work, and this gives the companies ever-increasing power, including economic power. Robert Mercer, for example, has a company that uses such self-learning algorithms and has never lost a penny.
Gravierend. Die User werden als
Users are what they call stimulus reaction machines.
Damit werden wichtige
Important information and interaction processes are being structured.
Die Nutzerpräferenzen werden gesteuert.
User preferences are being steered.
Die Festlegung des öffentlichen Sagbaren wird festgelegt. Das heißt, in was ist
It's decided what is politically correct. It's the internet that decides what can be reported and what must not be reported, what kinds of images are allowed to be shown or forbidden.
Politische Werbung auf die Person beziehen.
Political advertising in the United States can be referred to a single person. That was one of the bases of Donald Trump's success. Cambridge Analytica was involved in that, and when we look at the background of Brexit, we can still see the effect of Cambridge Analytica. And there is the hypothesis, a very depressing one, is that the attention-generating algorithms tend to focus attention on right-wing radical content, a permanent pressure towards the right. So we have a surveillance architecture which is not subject to public control. This surveillance capitalism has enormous power. It's unique in history, and that leads us to fundamental questions. What is privacy and what is publicity? And of course, a main topic for the future, the protection of the digital world as a central task for politics. And here is a brief commercial for my books. I described this concept in a book entitled Mythosmarkt. There's the book by Walter Lippmann, Public Opinion, and there is Populism for Beginners, and others. I thank you for having listened to me so intensively.
Ja, nee, lass mal.
Thank you very much for this highly elaborated and reflective presentation. It was good to hear that I know what I don't know is still relevant in economics of the 21st century. We now move on to the second speaker.
Martin Rauchbauer, before coming to San Francisco, Martin was Deputy Director of the Business Support Service and head of the UNESCO unit at the Austrian Foreign Ministry in Vienna. He was director of the Deutsche Haus at NYU in New York, and for 3 years he was the deputy director of the Austrian Cultural Forum in New York. Martin also served as director of the Austrian Cultural Forum in Mexico City and as desk officer at the Austrian Foreign Ministry. Today he is Austrian consul in San Francisco and co-director of Open Austria. His talk is AI and the New World Order. Please give a warm welcome to Martin.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for this kind introduction. Indeed, I'm posted since 3 years in San Francisco, and I want to start talking a little bit about this curious institution called Open Austria, which is one of its kind, set up by the Austrian Foreign Ministry in 2016, and also the Austrian Chamber of Commerce together, as an innovation hub primarily. But increasingly over those 3 years, we started helping startups from Austria, Austrian businesses, the Austrian economy to connect with the most important innovation ecosystem in the world, with Silicon Valley. But increasingly different topics came about, topics that connect us indeed with this midlife crisis of the digital revolution. We saw that in the Bay Area in San Francisco, there is a huge demand for reflection in the midst of this crisis on what technology does with our societies, what it does with our daily lives. And there, an input from Europe, an input from a country like Austria is more than welcome. So we've established a platform on cultural exchange in the Bay Area, a unique Silicon Valley cluster just recently, which will foster cultural exchange on the intersection of arts, technology, and science. And then the other thing that has come about very quickly was that Europe, Austria, other EU countries is seen as increasingly important as a regulator of this tech industry, of the global tech industry. And therefore we've become an interesting partner of conversations, and in particular in one area which I think people sometimes forget when they talk about artificial intelligence and its impact on our lives, its impact on our societies, is what kind of impacts does it actually have on how countries relate to each other and how the international system is going to be affected, I would even say disrupted. So in those years, artificial intelligence is the one technology that clearly impacts my trade as a career diplomat, diplomacy. There's an increasing demand for foreign ministries around the world to really learn what artificial intelligence is, how it impacts international relations, and how it is actually shaping the power structures of the world. I want to start with a witness who said only 2 years ago that whoever leads in AI will rule the world. Vladimir Putin at a school conference in 2017. Sounds very sinister. In all fairness, he put it into context and also talked about the challenges and the dangers this kind of global confrontation might entail. But whatever you think of Vladimir Putin, he probably knows about geopolitics. So when he says AI is important, he probably is onto something when it comes to the geopolitical implications. Now, by no means Russia is a leader in AI. However, it has been investing heavily in military technology in this field in the last years. And I think that there is an increasing realization in Russia that there also has to be an economic investment in the building up of an AI ecosystem in Russia. Why is artificial intelligence so important for the international system? Because geopolitics is determined by many of the same domains that AI is about to revolutionize. It has a huge impact on our societies and our political systems, when we just think of election interferences in several countries before elections, when we think of the impact on our economies, and also when we think of the impact it has on our strategic thinking. Why is that? If we look at the basic conditions for this AI revolution that we have been witnessing over the last years, we usually talk about these three factors. There have been improved data models, huge progress made in machine learning and deep learning, as well as unprecedented access to big data that Gerfried before called the new and the next raw material, which is a very geopolitical term. And then, of course, the increased processing power of computer chips, Moore's laws, the doubling of computer chip capacity over the last decades, which has kind of come to an end, but we know that there are technologies, that there are further technologies that are going to increase processing power even further and make this AI revolution also proceed in the future. When we think of what areas in the international system are going to be affected most, we of course immediately think of security and the military. Whether it is about weapon systems of the military, whether it is about domestic surveillance, whether it is about cybersecurity and cyber attack, whether we think about homeland security, or even logistics of the police forces, law enforcement forces, or the military itself, autonomous vehicles will of course also, once they become a reality, affect future military forces. So all these areas are going to be affected by artificial intelligence. And that of course leads to the question of what are governments doing about it. And I think what they are doing about it is that they are entering, willingly or non-willingly, into a global arms race. And that is a very dangerous situation, because the very narrative that we are in an arms race is a motivation for countries to invest in AI military technology. And this is a very dangerous thing. It's dangerous for ethical reasons. It raises all these questions about responsibility when we have autonomous weapon systems, but it also raises the questions of safety. If we are in an arms race and militaries deploy weapon systems that are not untested and that are not safe, they can be hacked, they can be easily compromised. What are the countries that are investing heavily in those technologies? United States, China, Russia, but also European countries like the UK, France, and Israel and South Korea. What we think when it comes to lethal autonomous weapon systems laws, we also have to think of what the international community can do about them, and there are discussions going on in Geneva where countries like Austria are trying to build a consensus on banning those legal autonomous weapon systems. So it's a technology that is a little bit different from other strategically important technologies like nuclear energy or like petroleum, in that it is readily accessible, not only for countries but also for individuals, and that we probably have to think of ways creating new norms that ban this kind of technology. But of course, Gerfried mentioned before that what really inspires everybody's imaginations is the confrontation or the perceived confrontation between two countries, one of which I'm posted in the United States, and the other one is China. Two superpowers of artificial intelligence. That's really the title of a book by a Chinese investor, Kai-Fu Lee, who just recently published his analysis of the Chinese AI boom, and he compared it to Silicon Valley. And his basic thesis was that China is not only a superpower in AI, but it is actually overtaking or about to overtake the United States in many domains. So is there a new Cold War which some media have been speculated about? Is there like a new tech Cold War, a Cold War driven by technology? Or is the very rhetoric of this Cold War in reality creating this dangerous dynamic? If we look at the big internet or AI-based internet platforms, in our previous presentation we heard about the big four, others talk about the big nine. Google, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, IBM, Amazon, the big six in the United States, but now joined by the big three in China, Baidu, Alibaba and Tencent, have really, the Chinese internet platforms have increasingly climbed the global rankings in terms of market capitalization, but also in terms of what they are able to do. They in many ways have better technology than the Silicon Valley-based internet companies. And when I say better, they provide more service, and we have to look at the question of whether this has to do with a different strategic approach in the United States, a different regulatory framework. China is a country with 1.3 billion inhabitants, certainly different kind of regulatory framework when it comes to data protection and privacy, and that allows those internet platforms in China, of course, to provide integrated, much better service, so to speak, but also, of course, to collect data of their citizens and to survey their citizens in a much better way. So if we look at the number of wireless users in China compared to the United States, you can see there a very concrete advantage of China. If you look at venture capital investments in the AI field, China has in recent years become very, very close to Silicon Valley and really has been catching up. And if we look at infrastructure, everybody is talking now about the issue of Huawei and the US government trying to ban Huawei, not only in the United States, but around the world. American diplomats have been pressuring other countries not to use Huawei technology in the upcoming fifth generation mobile infrastructure, which is going to be, of course, crucial to many AI-based applications such as autonomous driving in the future. If we look at the three main providers of 5G technology, Huawei, Ericsson and Nokia, we see that none of those infrastructure companies are US-based. So this is also something that the United States is very, very worried about, and there's a fear of missing out. Another issue that has caused great concerns and is seen as part of this great narrative of a confrontation between the US and the United States is the Belt and Road Initiative by China, grand infrastructure plan that is along the traditional Silk Route, but also includes many countries in Africa, Latin America, and also now increasingly in Europe. And what Americans in Silicon Valley say, in reality, a large part of this initiative is about promoting Chinese national industries in tech and helping to implement Chinese standards in order to challenge and end the American standards hegemony. So I would like to now talk about, if we look at this narrative of a Cold War, of course, if we think of the Cold War that ended in 1989, it was not just a big power confrontation, it was also an ideological confrontation. And this is the question that is being posed in Silicon Valley in the United States. Is this about liberal democracy being confronted also on an ideological point of view by digital authoritarianism? Is it really, in reality, about spreading an ideology of authoritarianism, not only in China domestically, but also around the world? And if we look at recent media reports about the situation in Western China, where there's a large Muslim minority there, the Uyghurs, that have been also monitored. At least this is what human rights reports suggest, monitored, surveyed, and in some ways also kept in check. Some reports talk about labor camps there with the help of face recognition, with the help of artificial intelligence. So this is also one of the dark sides of AI, of artificial intelligence, as a technology to survey and to suppress parts of your own population. And this has also become an export article by the Chinese government to other countries around the world. From a European point of view, the question also is, if there is this narrative of a confrontation, of a Cold War between China and the United States, does this mean that we will soon end up with having to choose between two worlds, Chinese-based AI technology versus US-based technology? This is something that in the United States people say is a very dangerous development, as countries don't like to choose, as it will also lead to a disintegration of the American economy and value chain, and therefore maybe be one of the motivations of the two countries actually talking with each other and avoiding this confrontation. How will future developments of AI affect this world order? There's been a lot of speculation about artificial intelligence, artificial superintelligence, intelligence, AI that surpasses human intelligence, and that some people speculate is going to happen at some point in the next years. And there's been several discussions that this might even further break apart the international world order, favor some countries over others, particularly those that invest heavily in surveillance systems, and that will give them a strategic advantage over liberal democracies. There's the New York futurist Amy Webb that wrote the book The Big Nine, where she talks about the Chinese and American internet platforms that are dominating the world and will dominate the world even further. And she really draws quite apocalyptic scenarios, talking about how artificial superintelligence in 50 years will have the potential to wipe out even entire countries when it comes to increased resource competition due to climate change. And therefore, she also calls for increased international collaboration and global standards in order to avoid this global arms race and global competition. One thing we also have to look at when we talk about the international system is the issue of the future of work that is going to be heavily impacted and affected by AI, and how this might affect different countries in a different way. We know that when it comes to AI, that it will not only be low-skilled labor, but also high-skilled labor that is going to be affected. It's probably, there's huge debates about how many, what the percentage of our current jobs will be replaced by AI in the future. But if we look at different countries and the likelihood of job replacement, we can see that it's about more or less the same in different countries and across different continents. In Africa, in Asia, in Europe, North America, and South America, it ranges between the low 40s and the low 50s, the potential of automation in our jobs. But the difference here is that, of course, developing countries have a much less likelihood to have access to artificial intelligence, which will probably mean that they will lose their competitive advantage that they have today when it comes to low-skilled work. And AI will widen the gap between the haves and haves not, those countries will lose their competitive advantage in low-wage factory jobs that could be repatriated to wealthy countries and replaced by AI-powered machines. And what that means for the international system when it comes to migration streams, when it comes to political instability in developing countries, we still have to also include in our calculations, which is why the United Nations is now heavily investing in the topic of artificial intelligence in order to appeal to all the countries to close the digital gap and to use AI as a global resource and help those countries develop strategies. At the moment, if we look at the world, there's been not only an arms race in AI, but also a race in developing strategies in order to give the countries and their economies strategic directions. There's just been a recent study by the United Nations comparing different countries. At the moment, there are about 44 countries that have an AI strategy. We have, with Open Austria, been involved in helping the Austrian AI strategy develop this fall. The European Union has asked all its EU members to come up with a national AI strategy by midsummer of this year, and we are kind of about to publish an Austrian AI strategy, which is going to be, I think, a very important element in this European context. I will very quickly gloss over the next slides. Government spending on AI is very, very high in China and very and comparatively low in European countries. If you look at the European role in AI, we have to still say that there's a kind of underdeveloped AI ecosystem in Europe, and there's a realization by the European Union that has published an European EU strategy at the end of last year that we need to invest and build up our own AI ecosystem as a response to this global confrontation between the United States and China. But then there's also this idea of doing this together with the EU countries and ask them to develop their own national strategies by 2019. What the EU has been very good at is a global standard setter in AI. It has published last year the General Data Protection Regulation, which really set a global standard, not just the standard in the European Union. It has actually also become a model for privacy laws around the globe. California has followed suit with the California Consumer and Privacy Act that is going to enter force next year, and it's very much modeled after the GDPR in Europe. And the other initiative that the EU has set is ethical, human-centered AI guidelines, which it published in April of this year. What I wanted to point out is that there is a role for Europe, but there is also a particular role for a country like Austria with its traditions in international conflict resolution, in international mediation, to be a place of negotiations, to be a place of international collaboration, where all these issues where we need to talk about AI, setting international standards, we need to talk about digital human rights and how they are affected by AI, where we need to fight the digital gap between the developing world and the United Nations, and where we also need to look at how to monitor and prevent lethal autonomous weapon systems. So there's been a call internationally for creating an international body that looks at all those things. I think Austria could be one of those countries. I think Europe should definitely take the lead in order to avoid this global confrontation. So thank you very much. We'll try to give you a glimpse of part of our work in Silicon Valley, which has to do with AI, which has to do with economics, but in reality it has to do also with international diplomacy. Thank you.
So, thanks a lot for this thrilling insight from a diplomat. We only have 5 minutes left for questions, because at 1 o'clock we have the next round of the symposium. So I will step back, and I'm sure there are some, as we say in German, burning questions. I heard people mocking about your positions. Okay, if not, okay, good. Martin, one question to you. At the very beginning, you mentioned about a program where you try to bring European creativity into Silicon Valley. What is the reason and what's the strategy behind it?
So we noticed that in Silicon Valley, there are a lot of tools being created, but there's a lack of content. There's a lack of content, and there's a high demand for creativity from wherever. So we have decided that we will bundle our cultural activities in Silicon Valley and do this together with our European partners, and the help of the European Union created this platform, which will look at the tech industry's needs, but also at the needs of artists, both locally in the Bay Area, as well as artists here in Europe, bring them together into dialogue and think of what the issues are when it comes to technologies and the challenges that technology poses to us, and bring artists as an important voice to the table. That's really our motivation behind it. We're just about, in the creation of this platform, and we've been supported by the European Union also financially to build up this platform. And what was surprising to us is how big the support was by the local artist community, but even by the local tech community, to build together with us this platform.
Okay, thanks a lot. So, Walter, one question to you. You made a very elaborate review onto the history of economics there. And my question is, and I don't know if you want to speculate, but drawing the vector from what you explained from the past and the present into the future, where are we heading to?
Of course, we come to political questions. The main idea for me is not to speak about technological development, as if it's run by own. It always depends on the kind of regulation, and that's a political question. So we must strengthen all these ideas which has been said with respect to the EU, and just one, weiter ist egal. Ich müsste hier widersprechen in der Problemaufbereitung. Es ist natürlich richtig zu sagen,
how to deal with the problem. Of course, it's correct to say that the liberal vision is confronted with the authoritarian vision. This is absolutely correct. But I would say that the authoritarian variants of capitalism as manifested in populism, and also the implications of the surveillance state. I mentioned Cambridge Analytica. We have to reflect on that more thoroughly. The tragedy of conservative thinking, which is currently happening in Europe, is that economic and political liberalism are being brought together, and this will not work anymore. We have to focus and emphasize political liberalism and stand up against the free and unbridled American economic capitalism. A lot of what the European Union is doing is good. For example, antitrust legislation applied to the internet companies. Those are steps which are the right steps to be taken, and we have to support that. I think that was a very appropriate concluding remark.
Engaging talks, and we are now coming to the second part of the symposium. We want to talk now about creativity, art, and education, but before starting, I have to make a short announcement. At 1:15, we will have a shutdown of Ars Electronica in remembering of the Fridays for Future. So it's not a power failure, but the whole Ars Electronica will be shut down for 5 minutes, as I learned. Is this true? Okay. So, huh? Okay. This was a secret? Oh, I revealed a secret. Okay, it was probably. Okay, good. Now you know it. So don't be surprised, but enjoy these 5 minutes. So before coming to our speakers, let me shortly go back into time to the advent of the digital revolution in the early 80s, at that time caused by the widespread of the personal computer. So finally there was a critical mass to initiate a revolution. And at that time, in digital art and design, the computer, the digital technology was mainly seen as a tool to animate, to do imaging, to do sound, etc. And it was actually and essentially the same what we did before as artists. So the tool was an important fact at that time. So we started teaching the tool at the universities, and I remember the time in the mid of the 80s when I had to tell the students, this is a mouse, this is a cursor, and if I move the mouse, the cursor moves accordingly. So this was teaching in the mid of the 80s. They had some elaborate students with which you could code already, but mainly it was very, very basics. So no one could foresee at that time that the digital technology is not only a tool, but also a medium, which then became later on the third mass medium of modern times after print and broadcast. So this was also reflected here at Ars Electronica. Beside the traditional award categories of animation, image, and digital music, Ars Electronica installed in the early 90s the interactive category, and at the end of the 90s, the digital community category. So there had been the traditional tool categories and now new categories in the media field. So now 40 years after the advent of the digital revolution, we see the millenniums and the digital natives coming to the universities. So now, because they are totally computer literate, we can finally focus more on the core values of art education. And this is unleashing creativity, this is developing attitude and social skills. So in the next 90 minutes, we want to talk and discuss education, we want to discuss creativity, and we want to discuss new places where all this can happen. And we will start with Lynn Hughes. Is she here? I haven't seen her. Lynn? Ah, okay. Okay, I introduce you, just a second. So, Lynn is Professor Emeritus at Concordia University in Montreal, where she held the chair of Interaction Design and Games Innovation from 2004 until 2018. Between 2000 and 2015, she was instrumental in founding of 3 major research centers that radically changed the context of interdisciplinary training in new media, art and design, and other disciplines in Montreal. Her own production focused on the design of hybrid physical digital experience, currently in the area between digital games, participatory theater and LARPing. The title of her speech, which I really like, is Digital Irreverence. Please give a warm welcome to Lynn.
Hello, I'm very happy to be here. In fact, I've changed you'll see there's a different title. So I did do a PowerPoint presentation specifically on the theme of the midlife crisis. And then I realized that this panel is really about creativity and education. So I decided to show instead the PowerPoint which I just gave in Shanghai. You see it has a kind of Shanghai-oriented title. And it also has the format I was required to do in Shanghai. So I will try to, as I go along, I'll try to pull out some of the themes that were in the other PowerPoint and just sort of connect it up to the theme. As was mentioned, I really have spent the last, actually about 20 years, trying to build research contexts for new media, particularly ones that are inclusive, truly interdisciplinary, which I think is really hard, and flexible. So I think I might need a way to move this forward here. So I'm at Concordia. Concordia is in Montreal. It's part of French Canada. But in fact, it's an English-speaking institution, although you can do things in French there if you want. This is part of the downtown campus. On the bottom right-hand is the fine arts area. We're a very well-known fine arts faculty, a comprehensive fine arts faculty. But the thing that we're best known for, the thing that I think is most significant and different about us, is the fact that we have very major new media infrastructure and I guess all kinds of ways of approaching interdisciplinarity within new media and art and tech. So this is the most recent institute. It established in 2015 by myself and 2 colleagues. 54 professors who are actually active, and 200 graduate students, mostly PhD. This is a very big school for Canada, certainly isn't for China, I discovered, not at all. There are two floors of equipment and space for research, big, large 2 floors, and also a very large black box and other sort of connected facilities. So we're very well endowed. But the most interesting thing about us is that we don't have a program, we don't have an academic program, and we're not connected to any faculty or department. Both of these things required a huge amount of fighting for, and I think that this new structure is the result of having tried to do other new media institutes over the years, ever since 2000, 2001, and discovered what was not so right about them. And no doubt there will be things we discover on this journey too. So there are 7 research clusters, from bioart through smart textiles to games, art and design and performing arts. But very importantly, of course, we also have people from computer science, etc. But what's most important, we feel, is that it includes the humanities disciplines, so this kind of breadth, history, English, literature, sociology, geography, philosophy. Whoever would like to come can come. So this kind of interdisciplinarity is really what is important for critical and ethical ways to look at, or just interesting ways to look at innovation. So the clusters evolve organically. The director of the institute doesn't tell people what to do. They're responsible for their own funding, externally or internally, and for their own research program. And the clusters really are not fixed. They can appear if there's a group of people who feels that something is not being addressed or that there's something new they want to do. And they can also die if they're not active enough, if nothing's going on. And for us, the sort of bottom-up aspect is really important. It's also really difficult. It took us a while. I think it's taken professors and students a while to understand what it means to be in a structure like this. So as I mentioned, this institute is not part of a department or a faculty or some section of the university. The early institute, Hexagram, which is still around and is a wonderful virtual network now. There was a show organized by Hexagram with many milieu students here last year. So Hexagram was part of the fine arts faculty, and this just meant that when people wanted to come from geography or somewhere else and use the resources, there was always kind of a tension, you know, about them using our things or our space or whatever our resources were. And so for this institute, we managed to wrest away control. That's not at all easy. It's really difficult to take things away from people at universities. But we managed to do this and to organize the institute so that it only answers to the vice president of research. This allows us to be really open, you know, very radically open to whoever wants to come. So the other aspect of this, as I mentioned, was that we don't have a program, and again, that's very deliberate. It might happen at some point that we decide to try to do this as well, but at the moment the idea is that the focus is on interdisciplinary research and that we don't determine ahead of time what that is and sort of fix it in a program. So students come in from all kinds of, they might come in as a sociology PhD student, for example, through the sociology department, but have professors who work at Milieu, and therefore they come and they are located, physically located by choice at Milieu, where they meet people from other departments. But also there are two interdisciplinary graduate programs. One is totally open and the other is a bit more limiting. Students have 3 professors, each one in a different area. And really in one of these programs you can put, as long as you can persuade the professors, you can put anyone together with anyone. This also requires a kind of student that is kind of independent and well organized, and so that's another challenge, but I think a really important one. So students can write traditional theses, or else they can write traditional written theses, or else they can do hybrid research creation, half written and half practice-based. The most important thing really for us is access to each other, including access between students and faculty. Everybody can have a space if they're willing to share it with other researchers. Even this was hard to do. There were people who had spaces that they felt were their spaces, and again, we had to make them move over to allow other people to come in. Everybody can use the equipment without going through a technician. So in the first institute, we had really fancy equipment and gatekeepers, technicians in front of every machine. And now this is just not the case. All the students and faculty can learn how to use even the very high-end machines. So I'm just going to show a couple of clips of work so that it's not all talking and words on the slide. So this is Barbara Lane's piece from Subtella Labs, Smart Textiles. Maybe if the music could go down just a bit, the sound. So what's interesting about this, it's very pretty. What's interesting about it is that it integrates multi-directional antennae. So on the chest of the dresses here, you'll see there the antennae, and as the dresses orient towards or away from each other, it changes the readout on the integrated LED panels, which are also developed at Milieu. So for this project, Barbara's team worked with a mathematician who's a specialist in mathematics for antennae. And at the beginning, he was very skeptical about this whole idea because what the artist required was that these antennae look like traditional embroidery, these very organic shapes. And he felt that the mathematics of what was required was just not going to, be possible. And in the end, this worked out very well. So it was one of those really happy collaborations. This is just a view of some of the equipment. This is a Tajima machine, which is a German-Japanese machine that does tacking. It does a kind of embroidery that we use for making designs with conductive thread. This is the BioArt lab. I just think this is kind of a humorous picture. So these are our students working with the live cells, so they're all dressed up. But there's other things that go on at the BioLab, and there's a very interesting project going on making textiles from kombucha. So you know kombucha, Japanese fermented tea, and the design on the front of it is also from live cells. So in 2008, I originally founded the Technoculture Art and Games Research Center with the sociologist. That's now integrated into Milieu. It's part of the larger institute. It was the first games research center in Canada. And again, the idea here was to sort of see games not as a thing where we're going to train people to go into the industry, but as a boundary, a research object, sort of a boundary shared object of research that could bring people together from all different areas of the university. Where we remain the biggest, most productive research center in Canada. Again, we do not have a games program. We're not making people for industry. We're really bringing together people who are interested in talking about games in different ways and proposing models of games that are different and games at the Tag Lab. View out of the window. Milieu has very nice facilities. So this is the terrace, the balcony that looks over the city, and we hold a lot of events or bring people in. Aspect is very important, and something we've been running for a number of years now is the Gamerella Game Jam for first-time game makers. It's really focused on women who have never made games before, women, trans, female identified. There are some men that come and they're very welcomed, but it's really, the idea is to make an environment that enables people to make games who would not otherwise make games, and it's been very successful. For 4 years, we ran all summer long experimental game incubators for international people. We had about 150 applicants and took 16 and tried to put people together in really different ways. And that got to be exhausting. It took up the entire summer for us. So then last year we just did 2 weeks where we had a group from Indie Nova, the games portal in China. 20 students came over and did experimental games. And I think for them it was quite a revelation because it was a really different approach to games. A lot of it very physical and electronic rather than simply screen and computer based. So that is really very characteristic of the kind of thing that's going on. It's something that I associate with this moment, I guess, also. This idea that digital is definitely not going to solve the problems of the world, even though perhaps it will help with things. And that the one thing we need to do is just assume that it's part of everything and put it back into the physical world. So there's a real, in French we say an engouement, an enthusiasm for especially alternate interfaces, alternate types of control. So there are people who do conventional screen-based games, but even then they often are in slightly different formats. This is a projection on the floor with camera interaction for gestures. A lot of the games will be games that have these physical interfaces that are about cooperation, intimacy, collaboration, sociality, really. And here's another one. This is a game for 2 players. One's the troubleshooter, and one's a person with a trouble. And the troubleshooter tries to help the other person through these augmented soft interfaces. This is a game made by 2 trans people, and I think that this is significant. I don't think it determines what the game is and why it is, but it's also something we're seeing a lot of activity in this kind of area. This is a game actually that was here in the Hexagram show last year, perhaps a ludic experience rather than a game. These wooden stones contain vibration, little vibrating pixel mechanisms, and you choose the vibration that interests you and you eventually exchange it with somebody for a promise. Here's a game, again, a tag made by a Brazilian PhD student. It's an immigration game where you're doing your exam for immigration, and the exam is to cook something from the country that you're applying to, in this case, Brazil. And you'll see, so there's quite an elaborate interface that is a stove where you can stir and put in ingredients and add water, etc. So this, I'll just finish with this. This is a game that I just did recently. It's a very odd game, again with a very physical interface. The interface is in lights and to some extent in sound on costumes. 2 players, one's an avatar and one is the player, but they're both real people. So the avatars are in the costumes. And the important thing about this, I guess, is that the avatars, the odd thing is that the avatars don't move at all. But they have biofeedback interfaces. So in fact, the person who is not doing action, who is not active, who seems to be still, who seems to be not powerful, is actually the person who potentially is the most powerful person in the game. So again, this is a sort of I guess it's some sort of a implicit critique of action games, action in games.
Prepare yourselves mentally and physically for the skill test in the battle to follow.
Welcome, players. Meet your avatars.
I think I'm very interested in playing with strangeness, and I think, again, that's something that I see around me, people trying to look again at types of ambiguity and indirectness. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Lynn, and you can be sure that I want to ask you afterwards of your understanding of digital irreverence. So we are coming now to the second talk. This is an old friend of mine, Hermann Vaske. Hermann is a director, author, and producer, and as a director, he worked with actors such like Dennis Hopper, Harvey Keitel, Udo Kier, and John Cleese. As a producer, he filmed with extraordinary human beings like Nelson Mandela, Stephen Hawking, and the Dalai Lama. Wow. His film was shown in Cannes, Toronto, and Palm Springs. His latest film, Why Are We Creative, premiered at the Venice Film Festival. His exhibition, Why Are You Creative, featuring artworks from Marina Abramovic to David Bowie, was shown in Frankfurt and Berlin. The title of his speech is Stimuli and Killers of Creativity. Please give a warm welcome to Hermann.
Yeah, I think, welcome. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the introduction. As you know, Ars Electronica is about choosing the best in media art, choosing and celebrating the best in media art. And you know, is judged according to criteria of editing or cinematography or ideas, fresh ideas. And then the visitors come and see what is the best in media arts. Yeah. And yeah, it's a week on concentrating basically on the new. This presentation is different. This presentation is about what's great and who's great. And when you go through a festival or exhibition like this, you see the new work, you know, some stuff may take your breath away. Other things may prove to be great. Other stuff may prove to be a gimmick or one-hit wonder, something that disappears straight away. And like I said, in this presentation I want to concentrate on the stimuli that are creative stimuli that are there since the beginning of time, and the creative stimuli that inspire us and learn from the people, you know. And it's basically, at the end of the day, stuff we are hungry for, you know. We are hungry for the advice, we are hungry for what those people can teach us, you know. And yeah, it's why your creative project, like you said, Joachim, it's something I do since a very long time, since decades. And I hope that works now. Here is a trailer.
Really ask why. Why am I creative? Is it in our blood? Do we do it to be remembered? To make ourselves attractive? To make ourselves immortal? Is it a reckless compulsion? Or do we do it to make a buck? We question our motives as we explore what drives us. Asking people who live this complicated life of self-expression, why are you creative?
Are you ready? Are we rolling?
My life had become an endless series of furtive meetings and hurried conversations.
Good to meet you, man.
Condemned to walk the earth for the rest of my days, approaching complete strangers and asking them,
Why are you creative?
Why?
Why was I born, for Christ's sake?
Oh gosh, that's such a hard question to give like in 2 seconds before I walk into the thing.
Das ist eine richtig gute Frage.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Why are you creative?
Instruction.
Am I creative?
Vielleicht sind wir nur deshalb kreativ, weil wir kommunizieren wollen.
I just want to add that Vaske movie took 30 years, which is a long time, and we really have to respect this, because 30 years is a lifetime to really insist on one idea, as he did. And I was asking yesterday, but now the movie is finished, what are you going to do now? And he said, I'm going to ask the question, why you are not creative? Not bad.
This crazy odyssey was careering out of control, but I couldn't stop. Yeah, as you could see, this film premiered at the Venice Festival last year, and Giorgio Gozzetti from the Venice Festival, from Gionato, said why we creative is more than a movie. And as he absolutely right, as you could see, it is an exhibition that was shown in places in Europe, and it will be an Instagram campaign and a new book. So, and after 30 years in this journey through an exploration of creativity in the various areas, cultural, philosophical, scientific, and artistic, I thought it's time to draw a conclusion on what are the creative stimuli. And here we go. Heritage. Our first influence, our parents, most important. And we have here Steven Spielberg. I have to add that every of my interviewees, I had conversations with, also answered the question in writing. He refers to his parents as his creative drive. So does Isabella Rossellini, as you know, her mother Ingrid Bergman and her father Roberto Rossellini. So she stayed in the same métier as her parents. Spike Lee refers to his father, a bass player, and his mother being an art teacher. And Julian Schnabel says, there you have it, my mother. Someone said in a usual psychoanalytic session, it takes about 2 minutes until the patient says, my mother. Same, Pedro Almodovar here with his mother. He took a lot of dialogues in his movies from his mother. And Sean Penn, coming from an artistic background, his parents were in theater and in writing, and he said, a big black hole in yellow, me. And I say, thanks, John, that brings me to childhood. So we have a childhood, John Cleese, that's very important, whether it's in the digital realm or in the analog realm, play. That's an eternal advice. Play, that's the secret, he says. And Wim Wenders also says, stay in touch with the child inside you. And he drew a bear as an answer for his question. There's Destiny, people who are compulsive creatives. You know, like Herman Melville, Moby Dick, you know, basically driven by obsession, hunting the big white whale of creativity. Nick Cave, a writer, a singer, a musician, he says, because I have to be. And Joji Yamamoto, he said to me that it is the fate of the artist. It's not a happy life, you know, to be an artist, because you are driven, you have no choice. And he said it's like a non-stop train. You know, you cannot stop it. Ordinary people can stop it, but artists cannot stop it. Hockney, I need to be, I love life. And that's an interesting answer. Tony Kaye, the film director, he cut himself, put his blood on the layout, and said, it's in my blood. Austrian race driver Niki Lauda said the same in a less messy way, in my blood. So we come to ambition. Ambition, you know, when you have a goal, you cannot, like Seneca said, those who do not have a harbor to sail to don't get wind into the sails, like these two guys from Switzerland, solar-powered airplane. Boschberg said to me, the mission to fly around the world is a very clear mission. There's no discussion about it, and they did it. And Stephen Hawking said, you need to be creative to do science, otherwise you're only repeating tired old formulas. You're doing nothing new. Money can be a killer, can be a motivator. Like Jacques Seguela said, money has no idea, only ideas make money. And he took this coin and pouched it through. Then sexuality. Here we have Japanese film director, actor Kitano. And that's his answer. As you can see, pretty obvious, because I have a big canon that's, I heard, is a translation. Or Damien Hirst bringing two things together in sexuality, 1 + 1 = 3. Rebellion, people go against the strain, go against the rules. Marilyn Manson liking to revolt against what he hates in America. IYY, the artist and activist. drawing a line through the question, and Pussy Riot, Nadia, this is her answer. Basically, they think we like to revolt against corruption and hypocrisy. Here we have, there's one from the digital realm, Mr. Netflix, Hastings, Reed Hastings, and he was saying that it's more fun than following orders. Pretty successful enterprise. And then I was a couple of weeks ago, I was at the, it was not Fridays for Future, but Smile for Future in Lausanne in Switzerland. And there were 450 young activists, you know, about discussing climate change and signing the Declaration of Lausanne. And I met Francesca Jericho here at the railway station of Lausanne in the demonstration, and she was drawing that poster sign. How can you use your creativity to bring through your goals, you know? And I found this a pretty remarkable message by Francesca. You know, the Industrial Revolution, the Digital Revolution, and the Digital Revolution turns into the Ecological Revolution. Like Joachim, you already announced that we will have the Ecological Revolution visiting us. Yeah, and that's her, Francesca, and that's her answer, because she's alive. Fear. John Cale, the musician, says fear's a man's best friend, and it can be. It can be. We have David Lynch, and you know, Isabella Rossellini told me an interesting story about him when they were doing a question and answer, one of his question and answer. And someone in the audience said to David, well, I don't understand your movies. And he said, well, I don't understand life, you know. And I think, so how he can use fear and this fear of the future as his muse, pretty remarkable artist. And this is his answer going into the unknown, into the lost highway, into the question mark, into the darkness. This is what I did with David Bowie. We choose to do a different kind of interview, like a Magritte surreal, me looking out of the window and David looking into the camera. We said basically, Gilbert and Jean Genet was once interviewed by the BBC, and we said, do we need to do the interview like this? You hear me there. Can't we stand on our head and talk with our feet? To be different, that's important. That's David's answer. He did that with coffee and milk, the whole. George R. R. Martin, author of Game of Thrones, and he said that there is this fear, there's this constant fear that one day the right brain may stop talking to the left brain, and then you become silent. Then I'm not writing anymore. So fear, an interesting one. To cheat death, we said immortality. This is what Goodby from San Francisco answered. Boredom, Laurie Anderson going against creativity as a reaction against boredom, and love, Tony Kaye, loving his profession. Individuality, Yoko Ono, because I am who I am. Willem Dafoe, because I'm a jackrabbit. And Neo Rauch, it's a good one, aus Sicherheitsgründen. Security reasons. Jim Jarmusch likes to put things upside down, you know, like dogs who don't understand something. Ed McCabe, Madman from Madison Avenue, shows his fingerprint, and Nelson Mandela, man and woman distinguishing him. To hurry up a bit, spirituality, we come to an end. We have the Dalai Lama who did the foreword to the book. Here it is, Quentin, it's a gift from God. And back to Marina, who has a spirit exit, you know, it's to be. And Marina also, like she mentioned, also encouraged me in doing this new film, Why Are We Not Creative, about the killers of creativity. And while Why Are You Creative about the encouragers, why we're not creatives about the beta blockers. And in our days of uncertainty, I think it's very important to know where the enemy stands, to avoid them. It's not enough to limply encourage creativity. Here are the killers: the better idea, bureaucracy, consensus, censorship, from state censorship to self-censorship, zeitgeist, money, education. Yes, education, as we all know, can kill. Gatekeepers, and distraction. Distraction is an interesting one, especially in what we call this title here, the midlife crisis of the digital revolution, because we are distracted constantly by 1 million text messages, WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, etc. How can we be creative when we are always fiddling with our phone and answering these things? You know, that's why I think we need to set aside time. We need to create a space in which we can be creative, you know. And that's what I tried to explain in the movie, which you can see later on. And you also saw the exhibition. And basically in the exhibition, I heard a radio interview with someone who described a press conference by Angela Merkel, and she said, in our past events society, she was the only one who was there. All the other people, all the other politicians and players had disappeared. She was the only constant. And I think in exhibition, I saw people looking at these little writings and pictures on the wall, and you know, it's like almost a sanctuary, a meditative process. So I come to an end. I'd like to end with Stephen Hawking. He said it's better to travel, hopefully, than to arrive. I'm still traveling, hopefully, trying to figure out the killers. And from all the answers, you know, there's as many answers as individuals on the planet. But there's one thing they all have in common. Creative people have in common. And that is, I am who I am, and I'm not afraid to be different. And in the case of Pussy Riot, in the case of the climate activists, and in the case of the protesters in Hong Kong, I should add, and we don't ask for approval. Thank you very much.
So Hermann, thanks a lot. So we're coming now to our last speaker, to our last talk. I was very looking forward to meet the person who is talking now, and this is Rachel Goslin. Rachel is the Director of Arts and Industry Building at the Smithsonian Institute. She brings over 20 years of diverse experience in the creative industry, social impact, program management, law and international and domestic public policy to the position. She's also, or she was, prior to her appointment at the Smithsonian, she was, served as executive director of the President's Committee of the Arts and the Humanities, and advisory committee to the White House on cultural policy. And under her management there, the committee launched 3 major national initiatives in education and cultural diplomacy, facilitated significant private investments in the arts and humanities, and spearheaded a successful campaign to use high-profile artists, actors, and musicians as advocates for the art education. The title of her speech, yes, I'm coming to the title now, is Cultural Institutions Are the Battlegrounds for the Future. Please give a warm hand to Rachel.
Hi, good afternoon. I know I probably am the thing that stands between you and lunch, so I'll try and keep to my 20 minutes. I didn't realize this was going to be theater in the round, otherwise I would have paid more attention to how I blow-dried the back of my head, but I'll try to keep moving. So my name is Rachel Goslins, thank you, and I'm the director of the Arts and Industries building at the Smithsonian, which is this glorious old building modeled after the great World's Fairs of the 1900s, which we are developing into a national space to think about the future. My own midlife crisis, I'm thinking about getting a motorcycle and maybe one of those facelifts that make me look always surprised. No, actually I've been thinking about it because I work at the Smithsonian, which is the largest museum and research complex in the world. Every year we welcome 28 million people through the doors of our museums on the National Mall. And I have been spending a lot of time thinking about how cultural institutions, like museums, like universities, like the one Lynn works at, like festivals like these, frankly, how we talk to people about the future. Because whether it's technically the midlife or not, we are definitely in a moment of public crisis about the future. Global polls show that people nowadays are more angry and more sad and more fearful than ever before. A major consumer poll in America, which has been going on for 60 years, last year found that for the first time, young people are less optimistic about the future than older people, which just seems wrong. So, in that context, I think we need to ask ourselves, what is the role of museums and cultural institutions to be part of this conversation? We are, interestingly, in this world of alternative facts, we are more trusted, museums are more trusted as sources of information than the media, than non-governmental organizations, and obviously than politicians. And so when you think about who gets to tell the story of the future, you've got to include museums. Because I know you guys think about museums as a place with objects in it, often very old objects in them. But museums are not actually about objects, and they're not necessarily about history, and they're not about buildings. They're about stories. They are about, the fundamental job of a museum is to reflect back to ourselves a story of us and the world around us, and to educate us, to inspire us, to make us question, and make us think. So if museums tell stories, what's the role of technology here? And interestingly, the role of technology is both as a tool and as a plot point. And I'd like to take a second and talk about both. So let's take a second to talk about technology as a tool in museums. How many of you grew up going to museums as a child? Oh, it's a very cultural crowd here, great. How many of you go to museums regularly now? Even more, I love that. And how many think you'll take your kids to museums if you don't already had them, or you do? Right, so this is like a constant touch point, and my guess is from the time that you started going to museums as a child, which for some of you was like 5 years ago, and when you will take your grandchildren there, you will see a huge difference in the way that we tell stories. So I actually think that we're in a midlife point in museums of how we tell stories with technology. So for the last 150 years, we had a pretty limited set of tools. This is my museum, our building, the Arts and Industries building, shortly after it opened in 1896. And, 1881. And in that time, we had a relatively limited tool set. We had objects, we had some explanatory text, we had a big octopus that we hung on the ceiling. I like to call this photo Find the Octopus. And for a long time, that's how we told stories. And then we introduced electricity. And electricity allowed us to do things like light things up and add sound and ultimately add video screens and then touch screens. So that was kind of the state of the world for a while. But in the last 15 to 20 years, this toolkit has exploded. We have VR, we have AR, we have immersive experiences, we have different kinds of accessibility aids. We have a whole new world of tools to play with. And we're playing with them in interesting ways. The Dali Museum in the St. Petersburg, Florida, is using recently created use AI to create a deep fake of the artist almost 30 years after his death. And this allows the mustachioed genius to tell you stories about his life, help you understand the art, and even take a selfie with you. At the Hirshhorn, one of our museums, our contemporary art museum on the National Mall, you can wander through the exhibits and using an app on your phone, which scans the art. You can use the Hirshhorn Eye to unlock artist videos and insider information about the art as you go through. And this is Pepper, our newest staff member at the Smithsonian, and Pepper is in use in 4 different museums to engage people about the artwork they're seeing, talk to them about how to look at art, and give them information about exhibits. So not only do we have different ways to tell stories, we also have different ways to access and process these stories differently. We have smartphones, we have social media, we have geolocation, right, which can track you as you move through an exhibit and curate and personalize the experience to you as you move through it. And you don't even need to be there anymore. This is at the Renwick Gallery, another Smithsonian museum. We had an amazing exhibit called No Spectators, The Art of Burning Man. And through a VR experience, people could experience the exhibit virtually through VR headsets at their home. At the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco, they have 2 robots that you can control remotely to offer virtual tours of galleries for people who are paralyzed or homebound or can't otherwise get to the galleries to visit. So these are amazing technologies and great tools that ideally will help us enrich and educate our visitors. But there's also some big challenges about this, because too often we confuse tools for strategies. And technology is only good if it's enhancing our ability to connect with people and tell stories, not if it's a gadget or a distraction. They also take a huge amount of, technology also takes a huge amount of resources. Museums spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on apps, and we're seeing our maximum rate of use and downloading cap out at about 6%. So this raises a lot of questions. And it's complicated because often the way that we use technologies reduces in museums the things we want to encourage: connection, engagement, slowing down. This is the Mona Lisa. Nobody's looking. Everybody's capturing. And when I was putting together this presentation, I actually realized I had this old historical photograph that went with this picture. And this is the Spirit of St. Louis, the airplane that changed the world, that allowed America and Europe to connect. And this is hanging in the Arts and Industries building in the early 1950s. And if you look at the expression on these people's faces, they're transported by awe and wonder and, oh my God, maybe they saw this thing once on the picture of it on the newspaper, and now they're in its presence. And you wonder how this picture would be different if they all had cell phones. So I do think that if it's not a crisis, we are at least at a point of inflection in the use of technology in museums, and how do we use it to tell better and richer stories. But actually, I'm even more interested in technology, not as a tool, but as a plot point, right? How are we talking about technology in museums? Remember how I was talking about the public crisis about the future, how we are more angry and fearful and sad than ever before? You guys were so great with the museum question. Let me ask, how many of you would say, and it's a super general question, that you are on whole optimistic about the future? Bueller. All right, a few. And how many of you would say you were pessimistic? All right, there's a bunch of people who are agnostic. Okay, well that's interesting. It turns out that how we feel about technology is intrinsically tied to how we feel about the future. So it's an interesting sample group here because you guys are all incredibly technologically savvy. So in preparation for this large exhibition that we're doing at the Smithsonian about the future, and I'm happy that one of our curators is here with us today. Hi, Ian, raise your hand. We engaged an international research firm to do a very far-reaching study on people's attitudes and hopes and fears to the future. So here are the responses we got when we asked people, here are some of the responses we got when we asked people to send us one image that represents the future to them. right? It's pretty dark. It's pretty scary. This made me really sad. And, you know, the thing is, when people are pessimistic and paralyzed and hopeless, they don't do anything, right? We just sit back and prepare for the worst and try and figure out how we're going to avoid it. So we were interested in this research to dig deeper in the question of how technology affects these kind of views. And across the board, it became clear that technology, fascinatingly, is seen as both the problem and the solution. Or to flip that, it is both the thing that scares us and the thing that's going to save us. So in one part of our research, we gave people a long list of relatively neutral but relatively hopeful things that could happen in the future. And we asked them, pick the top 5 that you think are most likely to happen. So these are the things that are most likely to happen. And what we got back is most likely, people think most likely we will have medical advances that will allow us to live longer lives. And that's obviously very tied to technology. Technology will make our lives more efficient. And technology, we're going to push technology as fast and as far as we can. So these are the things that we thought would happen, that people thought would be most likely to happen. But for every technological advancement that people identified, there was a corresponding fear. So for every good thing technology could do, there was a bad thing next to that. But then when we asked people the same question, but we asked them to force rank what they wanted, which of this long list of things were the kinds of things that they most wanted in the future, it was really interesting. We heard very little about flying cars or AI that could write poetry or music or 3D printers that could print our perfect breakfast. What we heard overwhelmingly is that people wanted to imagine a world that was more equitable, that was more collaborative, and that was more sustainable. And fascinatingly, they also wanted to imagine a world in which we were more connected and more human. So that was so interesting to think about. They wanted to think about ways in which technology could enable us to be more connected to each other and more human, which was just an interesting twist. I don't have some brilliant insight from that, but I thought that was really interesting. So the last question for you is, how can we, and I say this collectively because I run a museum, there's other people here who do exhibits, there are artists, there are public intellectuals, there are filmmakers. How do we talk to people about technology in a way that inspires hope instead of fear, that inspires action instead of paralysis? So we've been thinking about that a lot at the Arts and Industries building, and here I think we collectively all have to take a little bit of responsibility here, because people have so much help. We all have so much help imagining what could go wrong in the future, from the media to science fiction, from dark mirror to public intellectuals and amazing artists. I think sometimes we get so focused on wanting people to think about the consequences, the intended and unintended consequences of all these rapid changes that are happening to us, or we want to scare them into action, that we lose opportunities to also inspire them and empower them. We help them imagine what could go wrong so much more than we help people imagine what could go right. And believe me, as someone facing middle age, if you don't see some hopefulness and positivity in the future, you just want to crawl back in bed under the covers with a good bottle of Riesling and call it a day. So I think that is the question that I want to leave you with, without being falsely naive or simplistic at this technological midlife point of the way we tell stories and the stories we tell about technology. How can we tell more stories about what could go right? How can we start conversations about the future by asking people about their hopes instead of asking them about their fears? And how can we talk about and demonstrate technology that is a gateway to the things that connect us and the things that make us more human? I think that's what's going to be important for us, for our children and for our grandchildren that we're going to be taking to museums, hopefully for many years to come. Those are the questions we're asking at the Smithsonian, and I hope that they engender some conversations amongst yourselves as well with my little digression today about midlife crises, technology, and my own impending facelift. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hermann, stay on, please stay on, okay. So where's Lynn? Hermann, come to stage. So, as I revealed the secret, we only have 15 minutes. Okay, that's nice, a hug. Okay, it was intended, the title was Digital Irreverence. What do you think about what is this? Hermann, why are you creative? And Rachel, where had you been more influential, in the White House or in the Smithsonian?
Yeah, so I tried to slightly bring this out in what I did talk about. I think that what I'm seeing is that slow, really is the new fast, that physical is the new tech, or the sort of this desire to reintegrate the digital, just to see it as part, as having to be part of bodies and ecology, that's the way it needs to be now. So that is really what I'm seeing around me. So that also the connection with being local, with communicating intimately, one-on-one or one-on-three. All of those values are coming to dominate rather than the digital per se, which just seems part of the landscape.
Yeah, Joachim, I was anticipating that question. And yeah, for me it's clearly obsession. Beside making films, I just like to reflect about creativity, and I think it's an important topic, what drives us, and also point out what screws up creativity, because it's a dialectical synthesis of the opposite, and from that one maybe we can draw some conclusions for the future.
So I think my question was whether I can have more impact when I was at the White House or at the Smithsonian. I gotta say, I think the Smithsonian, the White House was an amazing opportunity, and I got to create many programs which had very targeted impact, and it's an incredible platform. But the Smithsonian is a storytelling organ, and the amount of people that it can reach, even if it's just that fifth grader, I don't know what the equivalent is in Austria, who sees something or thinks something that then has ripple effects in the way they move through the world. I think that's an incredible opportunity that hopefully something I'll imagine on my deathbed that I got to do.
Okay, predictable questions with predictable answers. So, any other questions here in the space? Where are we? Here.
Yeah, thank you. Rachel, was a great presentation. You asked, my question would be, do you have any idea when and why the change came about being pessimistic about the future? I mean, Ars Electronica started with the idea of a great future with technology, and you brought it, now it's broken down somehow. So when did it change and why? Could you give us an idea how to change it?
I think there are people much smarter than me who've probably written great articles about that and have thought a lot more. I don't mean to be cliche, but I think it might have something to do with this midlife point we're at. When you start anything, whether it's a new project, or you have a kid, or you get married, or you start a new job, in the beginning it's just all promise and hope and excitement, and everything looks amazing, and then you reach some middle point where it gets really messy and really hard, and everything just seems so complicated, and it's so much easier to imagine what could go wrong than what could go right, and you have to you have to push through that and figure out what's important to you and orient yourself to it. So I think globally we're having that experience with technology where all the promise, we see all the promise, but now we're also understanding all the peril. I also think, just from having worked in DC and in politics, you know, the 24-hour news cycle, the way that we emphasize, you know, clicking and getting somebody's attention and saying the most extreme thing so that you know, get the most eyeballs, leaches a lot of nuance out of these conversations. And, you know, they've done lots of studies that like positive news stories don't get half as much attention or reshares or tweets than negative news stories. It's easier and more.
Okay, we have a question over there.
Hi, I have a question for Lynn. In your presentation, you mentioned that your program isn't focused on industry employment for the students. For a lot of European-based programs, it could be very inspiring to get to know a little bit more where your students go after they...
2015, although there have been previous iterations of them, it's not something we know that much about. But I think we feel like we're training people for everything and nothing, and maybe that's good. It remains to see whether that's the case.
Okay.
Darf ich die Frage auf Deutsch stellen, sonst werde ich noch nervöser. Und zwar auf der Ausstellung, aber auch bei der Frage nach dem, ob man positiv oder negativ in die Zukunft blickt, ist für mich immer, oder kommt für mich halt mehr und mehr heraus, dass der Zweifel eigentlich die Stärke des Menschen gegenüber von der schnellen und möglichst effizienten Antwort des Computers eigentlich überwiegt. Wie könnte man, also und jetzt zur Frage, wie kann man das gesellschaftlich stärken und den Menschen die Zeit geben, dass der Zweifel berechtigt ist und dass man quasi so große Fragen auch abwiegen kann. Welche Möglichkeiten wird es da geben, quasi das zu institutionalisieren? Kann man das so sagen? Ja.
Okay, I try to translate, but I'm not sure that I really got the question. So it's about the topic of doubt and how can we give time to deal with doubt in terms of dealing with all the new technologies.
Yeah, I think doubt is a very important one, and in the moment of doubt is especially when you are really creative. You know, I mean, I'm freien Fall, working without a net, and I think we should allow for a culture of failure also. You know, to allow failures and. Individually or in companies, you know, and that I think is a positive way. I don't know if you mean that, but yeah, that's what I would say.
Maybe I could just say that I think that that's something that I find really interesting, and maybe I'm thinking of it slightly differently than just doubt, but something like strangeness, as I mentioned. So I just saw a new talk by Fiona Raby in Shanghai. It was a wonderful talk where she really was talking about where she is now. So she wrote Speculative Everything. I don't know if you know that book. And she was really saying what we need to do now is to design for unreality, to design for something that's floating, that's something that's not, we don't quite know what it is, something that is strange. And so I think that's very difficult to do, and to feel, and to sort of accept it, and to feel that it's done or whatever, but it's something that I think is interesting.
Another question? So I have another question for you. So you talked about the reasons why we are creative, and you really nicely categorized them. It was really structured work. But it seems that no one is, or you are not asking about how can we foster creativity. It's something like a given situation, but how can we are teachers, we have a lot of young people working with us, so I want to get a little bit of insight.
Yes, that is an important question, and like I said, the dialectical synthesis of the opposite. We have the why are you creative for what boosts creativity, why we're not creative, what kills creativity. And the third one of the movies will be what makes us creative. So in other words, how. So now I said it. Yeah, but it's something I have in mind. And I think, yeah, it's totally important, you know, about advice and teachings and, you know, where to go and where not to go. And, you know, the readers or the viewers always have to decide for themselves what they take with them or not. But it's something I'm working on, yes.
So I was hoping to get a little bit more of the recipe, but I'm waiting the next 30 years for this. So, Rachel, is there other questions here? I don't want to go in a dialogue.
I'll talk about China today. And I have a question to Mr. Hermann. Do you know some creative Chinese, except Dalai Lama, like director, artist, or anything? So what's your impression about them? So.
Yeah, I met a few creatives from China, of course. Ai Weiwei, you know, and activist and artist. I met Ang Lee, the film director. He basically, answering the question, also said for him it's no choice, you know, it's also a compulsive creativity. And I was at the opening of 4 young media artists from China that exhibited. That opening was in Berlin at Kulturforum 2 days ago, which was co-curated by Frau Gebhardt and Udo Kittelmann, who is the director of Hamburger Bahnhof and the Nationalgalerie, National Gallery. And that media art was quite impressive, what I've seen there. Yeah. So that's a quick answer.
So I think that show was Lu Yang.
Okay, more questions? I want to go for next minute, because then the big shutdown is coming, and we want to experience the shutdown and not only say goodbye.
That's the thing, how to be creative, you know, a surprise, you know.
Okay.
Surprise way, that takes your breath away.
Yeah. Good, any more questions? Any more questions? Okay, we have a last one here.
I've got a question for Hermann Vaske. It's a complicated question, but how do you define creativity? Because creativity, let's say, for a race car driver is probably a different concept than for a painter.
Well, not necessarily. You know, if you look at Muhammad Ali in the boxing ring, or Ayrton Senna in a racing car, you know, or Pelé on the football field, they showed their creativity there. But to define it is basically what Eisenstein said, to bring together 2 things that do not belong.
Festival visitors, it is now time for a break. We will now take a moment to think about our future on this planet. Please share this moment with us. The festival will freeze in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now.
Test, test. Dear citizens of our Earth, we are a group of climate activists. As Fridays for Future, we were invited to speak on the stage about climate change. We shut down this festival in an effort to prevent a global shutdown of a much larger scale.
Liebe Menschen unserer Erde, wir sind eine Gruppe Klimaaktivistinnen und Klimaaktivisten. Als Fridays for Future wurden wir eingeladen, auf dieser Bühne über den Klimawandel zu sprechen. Wir haben dieses Festival mit einem Shutdown unterbrochen, um einen globalen Shutdown mit viel dramatischeren Folgen zu verhindern.
Climate change is real. It is happening right now. For too long we have been looking away. Even in light of all the proof, we refuse to get out of our box, our comfort zone.
Der Klimawandel ist real. Er findet genau jetzt statt. Zu lange haben wir weggesehen. Trotz aller Beweise weigern wir uns noch immer, die Realität zu akzeptieren und unsere Komfortzone zu verlassen.
It is our responsibility as individuals and the responsibility of our elected governments to prevent a climate catastrophe. We, as the people, need to focus on this one important topic. A large amount of information is presented to us as urgent and important, but nothing can be as important as our climate. It is our source of life on this planet. We do not have the time to get distracted any longer. The time to act is now.
Es liegt in unserer Verantwortung als Einzelpersonen und in der Verantwortung unserer gewählten Regierungen, eine Klimakatastrophe zu verhindern. Wir als Menschen müssen uns auf dieses wichtige Thema konzentrieren. Eine große Menge an Informationen und Nachrichten wird uns als dringend und wichtig präsentiert, aber nichts kann so wichtig sein wie ein stabiles Klima. Es bildet die Lebensgrundlage auf diesem Planeten. Wir haben keine Zeit, uns noch weiter ablenken zu lassen. Die Zeit zu handeln ist jetzt.
People of the world, people of all ages, all professions, no matter your political agenda, get together to create a world worth living in for future generations. You can start right now. Each decision in your job, your family and your lifestyle can make a difference.
Menschen auf der ganzen Welt, Menschen jeden Alters, aller Berufe, ungeachtet der politischen Gesinnung, schaffen wir gemeinsam eine lebenswerte Welt für zukünftige Generationen. Starten wir jetzt damit. Jede Entscheidung im Beruf, in der Familie und im eigenen Lebensstil kann einen Unterschied machen.
Join us, march with us. In 10 minutes, we will walk from the entrance area of the Ars Electronica Festival to the Volksgarten, a nearby park. Come with us, spread the word and make a statement.
Begleitet uns, geht mit uns gemeinsam diesen Weg. In 10 Minuten werden wir vor dem Eingangsbereich des Ars Electronica Festivals zu einem nahegelegenen Park, dem Volksgarten, gehen. Wir freuen uns über alle, die mitgehen. Motiviert andere und spread the word.
Regarding the demonstration, the park is really very close, so it's just a 10 minutes walk down there. We will get together in the courtyard downstairs and we will take a picture of the group. Everyone who wants to be part of the picture can go down with us, and everyone who wants to come with us at the rally, we will walk from like 1:35 to like 2 o'clock, and then everyone can come back to this festival and discuss the matter. And yeah, I hope many of you are joining us. Thank you very much. zum Volksgarten nach vorne. Wir werden uns